Beorning class in the Lord of the Rings Online is going to receive a pretty big overhaul in Update 37, which is expected to release later this month in August. Today, I have a quick review of the revamp and what you can expect to change for your Beorning. Now, starting off here with a couple of quality of life changes for the class as a whole. First off, you can change in and out of bear form without any sort of wrath requirements. Of course, my character has 100 wrath right now, but you do not have to have wrath to actually go into bear form, and you can do that from 0 wrath. Additionally, all Beorning specs will have access to Claw Swipe, which used to be exclusive to the blue line. Now, Claw Swipe can gain additional effects depending on your specs, such as in red line it will give a bleed, and in yellow line it will give a fellowship heal. Finally, you will notice for Nature's Vengeance, that is now going to have a little bit of a wrath cost associated with it. This probably won't impact gameplay too much, but it is important to point out. And moving on here for the specializations, the big things that you will notice with the blue line is just its relatively buff state with a little bit better access to some self-heals, defenses, and especially some cooldowns. Now, importantly with the blue line Beorning, you are expected to stay in bear form basically the entire time you are in combat and tanking. Of course, in the beta here, I am here solo, so I won't really be able to tank with a group, but with the blue line, you're going to notice some relatively low damage compared to the DPS spec now, but you have access to a lot of abilities to sustain in this case, solo group content potentially. And of course, if you have the capability to solo group content, you probably are going to be a good baseline tank when it comes to actually having a group for your group content. Now, while I am in combat and slowly tearing away at this orc, I do want to point out a few abilities with the blue line Beorning here. First is going to be guarded attack, can now be used in any form, so naturally you'll be able to use this a lot in bear form. This used to be man form only, and this gives you a little bit of physical mitigation, and the buff can actually stack up to 5 times, and as you see here, I have it up to tier 5, so we get 10% physical mitigation. A couple other abilities you might notice are actually from the red line with this specific build. It's not necessarily a build I would recommend for general tanking. This is just one I built for the beta for a little bit extra damage as my tank Beorning, and it was a good option for solo. If I were tanking group content or wanted a lot more survivability, I would consider some traits in the yellow line instead. Either way, these two abilities from the red line just build wrath, which can be helpful in maintaining wrath in bear form as a blue line Beorning here. Now, you might notice my skill bar there was actually bugged and got me confused, but you might also notice that you can use abilities like Hearten and Ferocious Roar. Eventually, at least, you can use both of those in any form, which does mean you can use them in bear form and Ferocious Roar. That last bonus is what lets you use it in any form, but with the trait to increase your max morale, that's a pretty solid defensive boost while you're in bear form and you don't have to leave bear form. Similarly, Hearten is a good self-heal, and you can use it in bear form. It helps regenerate morale quite quickly, and you can sustain longer fights with that without needing heals. Moving on from that, I do want to talk a little bit about the extra cooldowns that the blue line Beornings have, which include counter is one we already had, and this just increases our evade chance, and when we evade we will have the opportunity to use counter attack, which does moderate damage and gives you a little bit of wrath. We will also have thickened hide, which increases threat over time. That is actually something you will notice with all of these cooldowns, as they increase your threat against enemies, helps you maintain aggro when you use these defensive cooldowns. Thickened hide is pretty basic in that it just reduces incoming damage by 60% for 15 seconds, has a 2-minute cooldown. Counter, by the way, has a 40-second cooldown, and you can have about half uptime of that evade buff and counterattack opportunities that come with it. Nature's Fury is going to be a pretty strong cooldown in that you get 100% evade chance, and you become immune to combat states, and you also reflect damage. This is a 15-second duration buff with a 2-minute 30-second cooldown. And then Thorned Armor rather is pretty similar, but it has a little bit of a stronger reflect against the enemies that hit you, and it only has a 10-second duration, but it has a 55-second cooldown, so you can use it more frequently. That said, this one does cost 50 wrath, so it has quite that expense with it. Now, otherwise, when it comes to actually building the blue line Beorning, it is going to be fairly similar to before, but you will notice a lot of different traits and some different options that you have, such as Dancing Bear here, which gives you quite the evade bonus, but also when you evade an attack, you get incoming healing rating boost. You will also see reshuffle of a lot of traits. Again, an example here is going to be Recuperate, is available a lot earlier in the trait tree, and it does provide a decent self-heal at a very short cooldown and a strong hot component to it as well. This does mean that something like Recuperate is easily accessible as a red line or even yellow line Beorning when you are a higher level. Armor Crush is still going to provide a very valuable debuff with 12% incoming damage. This is technically weaker than the previous version though. And then for something like Armored Hide, I believe this trait used to be split for a trait with physical mitigation, a second trait with tactical mitigation. Well, now it's all in one, so very convenient. Spend half the trait points, get the same effect. And then for some of the cooldown abilities that I talked about before, Thorned Armor here is going to be in the second to last row, and then you can get Nature's Fury is going to be in the last row, and also Thickened Hide is in the last row. So a lot of your big defensive cooldowns come a little bit later in the trait tree. You also get Thunderous Roar, which we already have, but this is going to be the big AoE Roar in the second to last row now. Now again, this build was just a temporary beta build for specific uses as I was testing this in the beta, but some trait that you might consider is something like Opposing Presence, which does impact Claw Swipe and gives it a special effect for Blue Line Beornings beyond the normal extended threat that it has, and that it will be a force taunt with the last rank but comes at an increased cooldown. This is like the old Blue Line trait that impacted Serrated Edge but now impacts Claw Swipe. By Serrated Edge, I actually mean Biting Edge. It's just with this build I have the trait to convert Biting Edge into Serrated Edge. For set bonuses, again, Cultivate here is going to allow Ferocious Roar to be used in any form, including bear form. There's also this nice automatic cooldown ability. It has a 1:30 internal cooldown, but whenever your health dips below 30%, you get a heal and some increased wrath. Also for the trait, the set bonus that allows Hearten to be used in any form, that is going to be the second one here. And finally, the first trait is, or set bonus rather again, is the one that gives guarded attack and allows you to use it in any form. So those are some of the primary differences for the blue line compared to what we have right now. And moving on to the red line, this one is changed quite a bit, and there are, I meant to change here, but there are quite a lot of drastic changes going on with the red line. I think the most important things is that you just have a lot more abilities and a lot more useful traits in comparison to before. Again, don't necessarily mind this very specific build I'm using for the beta as I was testing things. There are probably some changes I would make, such as probably not getting all 3 points in Nature's Wrath. But to cover some of our new abilities as I fight this enemy here, so one thing we do have, similar to before, is the good old Ferocious Roar Maul combo. That is something that is still going to work. You get a crit on every single tick of Relentless Maul after using Ferocious Roar. But in bear form, you will notice quite a few new abilities, including a couple new finishers. So first off, we do have Claw Swipe, and again, that gets a bleed in the red line from one of the set bonuses here. We still have Bash, which is a pretty strong bleed, but you will also notice Nature's Wrath, which I recently covered, adds Wrath, and it's just a simple bear form ability in the red line. Trample, simple bear form ability that adds Wrath, but also debuffs the enemy, reducing their crit defense and BPE. I have Armor Crush from the blue line with this build. And then we have new finishers. So Execute is actually going to be worth picking now, and that does a lot of damage to a single target when you have 75 Wrath, and the enemy still must be below a health threshold. And then you will also have Final Strike here. This one is going to be another finisher. It costs 75 Wrath, and this does massive AoE damage, while Savage Knockdown does AoE damage and has a knockdown effect. It's not quite as strong as Final Strike here, so a little bit less damage, but does come with the knockdown component. Again, for single target, Execute is going to do the most damage. In very preliminary testing, it does seem that consuming Wrath is actually going to be worth it now with these abilities. With the current implementation in the beta build, it is technically best to stay around 75 to 80 Wrath, so you have the maximum crit chance here, which is going to be 16% crit chance, and then you can consume your Wrath with one of these Wrath consumers here, your finisher abilities. That is something that has actually already changed throughout the beta, so we'll see how that stands when the final release of Update 37 comes out. Now, a couple other abilities that I did not cover are going to be our cooldown abilities. So the Beornings do still get Call to Wild, which now just gives additional Wrath for your Wrath generators, and your Wrath consumers cost less Wrath. And you do get a pretty big 30% melee damage buff for 15 seconds. That's on a 2-minute cooldown, pretty similar to what we had before. But a new one that is going to be a trait here in the third to last row is Blood Prize. It requires 5 ranks to get the full effect of it. But this one increases bleed damage by 50% for the 20-second duration and has a 1.5-minute cooldown. And finally, Ferocious Roar acts as before in that it generates Wrath over time, but also gives you the guaranteed crit of your next attack, which again can impact all pulses of Brutal Maul. And finally, for the building aspect of the red line, you will notice a lot of things are shuffled around and a lot of new traits with the new abilities. Some important things to point out again are going to be trample here. The first one just gives you the trample ability, and then you have the 2 traits that impact it. Also, execute is going to be linked to a lot of stuff here at the bottom, and I will point out that composure is going to be in the bottom row now. You actually have 4 traits in the bottom row, and those are a lot of the very important differences compared to before. As you see, I have very little time to cover the rest of this, and because I don't actually play Yellow Line Beorning, I am going to refer to the notes for the rest of this video. So because I don't really play Yellow Line Beorning all that frequently, I have played it a few times maybe in the past few years and just not really anything serious. I don't have the best context for what the gameplay was like before to compare some of the new changes, but overall what you will see with the Yellow Line Beorning is a little bit less raid-wide healing in favor of more fellowship healing and just a couple new options for heals. You will also notice slightly reduced support with things like debilitating bees, which is at the top of the yellow line, just like the other trait trees. A lot of the traits were shuffled around. So for example, here with some of the changes, we have Rejuvenating Bellow, which is now going to be cast on a target, and anybody in the target's fellowship rather, will be healed instead of it being a raid-wide heal. Relentless Maul and Nature's Salve are still going to be raid-wide heals though. Nature's Salve, of course, is going to be a new ability with a relatively long cooldown. It does generate wrath, but it has a 45-second cooldown, and it's a 10-meter area around the bear, which is going to be a raid-wide heal. Now for single target healing, their new option is called To Your Aid here, which is a 20-second cooldown heal that does have 20 wrath. Now this trait is relatively early in the yellow tree, unfortunately I can't show that right now, but this is actually a potential pickup for your blue or red line Beornings if it's something that you do want, just to point out. Also for Debilitating Bees, just to point out, that is again in the first row of the yellow line, so it's very easy to pick up as a blue or red line Beorning. So overall with the Beorning, you can expect quite the number of changes with this update, but mostly it is to positively impact your character. There are of course some changes and more, say, nerfs for the yellow line, but the blue line tanking is basically straight up buffed with a lot of new options for cooldowns and abilities. Similarly with the red line, new options for cooldowns and a lot new abilities and finishers to actually consume your wrath, in contrast to previous red line Beorning gameplay. And then of course in yellow line, a lot of the heals have been moved from raid-wide to fellowship-wide, but you are getting a couple extra options for heals, even one new option for a longer cooldown raid-wide heal. I hope you all enjoyed this video on the upcoming Update 37 revamp for the Beorning class, and that it's helpful to prepare you for when the update comes out and what changes you will see for your Beorning. As you saw, I did get this video in at the very last moment, and I unfortunately did not get to the Guardian, which I will have to check out in the next beta round. If you do have any feedback on this video, I would appreciate it so I can improve for the Guardian video coming later. Personally, I am very excited for the Beorning revamp, but that is for another video. For this one, if you did enjoy, please consider liking and subscribing for more, and thanks for watching everyone.